Hello and welcome to week 13. We are getting so close to the end of the semester here, and that's terrifying for everyone concerned. We are entering a particularly interesting time of the semester. We have 2 weeks this week and next left. Then we have a week off. And then we have one vestigial week. And vestigial was a word that came up a lot in class today before we enter exam week and the submission of final on essays and final sharing. So we're in crunch time, and this is the time in which I structure things based on students' stars and wishes. And so we kind of talk at mid semester about what are you thinking about for your unessay? What are the things that you've been really excited about over the last little while? What are the things that you wish we had more time to talk about or that we haven't talked about yet at all? And so last 2 weeks, students have been going through the kind of guided, adopted TTRPG questions. And we've been going through that. And while they've been doing that, I've been scrambling to assemble 2 weeks of kind of classes, that's 4 class sessions, that cram as much of those interests and questions in before Thanksgiving as we can manage. So, I'm calling this week Experiments in Games. And so today is Games for Children. So that was a request straight up from students in terms of, you know, what are games that are specifically designed for younger players, that are designed to be the first game that kids play? And there's a ton of them, hundreds of them, so many, so many. And TTRPG Kids is a really great repository for reviews and information about them, including roughly like, are they all ages? Is it 8 and up? Is it 12 and up? Where can you find different games? Because as we've been talking about all day, there's a real market and a real interest in gamification. Now, gamification is a complicated notion. In its crudest sense, it's really just kind of same song, different verse of standard bean counting in a class, as opposed to being a revelatory way of rethinking both what happens in the classroom and how we value what we value. So, one of the challenges that I face as someone who is very clearly visible in terms of thinking about games and education is that often I find myself facing colleagues who have a different idea about what games are for. Games in a gamification model are often a tool to get to the same kinds of learning outcomes and quantifiable scores and metrics without actually changing anything in terms of the larger system. I, on the other hand, am a person who's really interested in critical play and in the ways in which thinking about games and thinking playfully can instead open up new ways of thinking about value, how we spend our time, and kind of start to release us from the quantification that often is seen as identical to gamification. So that's where I come from with all of this. And so I decided to have us take a look at 2 different games, one that was built from the ground up for a kind of all audiences method of play, an easy onboarding, as well as it was originally designed for use in actual play, although it hasn't really been used in that way very much. Quest RPG. And I don't have Quest RPG in my hot little hands, in part because I have the PDF, and my nephew has the physical copies of the book. I bought it for him originally, and there may come a day where I buy another copy for this class. And indeed, I think Quest RPG was a really interesting object for us to do close reading on, so much so that we spent most of class looking at it. What we also had open on other tabs was Wizards of the Coast's uh, materials designed for after school programs, as well as literal lesson plans for teachers for use of Dungeons and Dragons in the classroom for both grades 4 to 6, as well as grades 6 to 8. And so, for much of the initial part of class, we were walking through the initial way that Quest RPG describes itself. And then along the way, we started to compare it to the documentation that D&D talks about in terms of the game, in terms of how to create a character, and how mechanics work. And what was interesting about this is I was able to print out Quest RPG's character material, which really works like Mad Libs. It's literally a, kind of set of prompts in a sentence format. And the first 20 some odd pages walks you through the intent behind how to fill in each of those blanks and gives you some possibilities for how you might fill in those blanks. Basically, big ol' lists of possible phrases. It doesn't leave you hanging out to dry with any of this material. A lot of hand holding happens in Quest RPG, even though it's a pretty simple setup. So we went through and walked through a lot of that. Now, I couldn't print out Wizards handouts, even though they are literally marked as intended for reproduction, for photocopying or printing. And that's because I have a LaserJet printer that and toner is pretty expensive once you're getting into the kind of multiple shades of gray that all of these sheets would have printed out in. Wizards of the Coast doesn't, at least as far as I was able to find, and I think I've searched even more diligently than, say, my students who are practice teachers or other folks might. I looked for printable versions, things that had been simplified and clarified that didn't have a cream background, but a white background, that were designed for high contrast black and white printing. And I couldn't find any. So we just projected them on the screen because that was the deal. And so, what we also came across in our discussion beyond mechanics was a simple question about user interface, about document design. And this is where I remind you, if you're not kind of recalling, that a significant number of the students are public and professional writing students who have a required set of document design and like usability classes under their belt, and this class fulfills a diversity requirement for their major. I also have a bunch of future K through 12 English education students in the room. So this was a great day for everyone. We had the education students looking really closely at at vocabulary choices. Quest RPG is remarkably simple, but then comes up across some really interesting word choices that are higher order. So lest you think that Quest RPG is just for kids, the use of words like megalomaniac and indeed vestigial in several places would suggest that either you need to have a dictionary or a trusted adult with you, or this game didn't entirely intend to be exclusively for children. It's simple and easy to onboard, which is good for any age. Some of the vocabulary choice was pretty advanced. Now, that said, Quest RPG often paired those kinds of intense, $10 words with simplified explanations in context. So it is possible that this could have served a pedagogical purpose in many cases. You weren't left hanging out to dry on megalomaniac without any kind of context clues as to what that meant. That said, there is reference to sexual violence and to torture. Like those phrases are kind of literally stated in the discussion around things that you have to agree on at the table, which is quite interesting because what? Um, since when are we talking at that level? But as we discussed, this is also a game that includes the possibility of death, and we had a big discussion about, when is death appropriate to bring into a game in terms of age and appropriateness, which is really heavy stuff. right now at the time of this recording, as it always is. But and the difference between the abstraction of people die and I could die or I will die, right? This is tricky stuff. So we had some discussion about the kind of variable age situation when it came to Quest RPG. What was interesting when we turned to the equivalent sheets for wizards was that there's a lot less support provided on those sheets in terms of how to answer those questions about describing your character or making certain kinds of choices. And then the subsequent sheets are all, of course, about math and mechanics. And that's why the lesson plans argue that this is really good for STEAM because they're doing a lot of math, right? If you're playing D&D at any level, you are doing a enormous amount of math, and that math is not eliminated from these kind of versions for the classroom or for after school kind of encounters. Instead, we get a walkthrough of character formation that's pretty flat, and includes bubbles that, as one student noted, the average fourth grader would probably need more space just in terms of their own handwriting to be able to fill those out and have their handwriting fit. So, some interesting kind of friction in terms of document design and lack of kind of guidance for how to answer questions, little friction in terms of vocabulary for Quest RPG. This is not a compare and contrast. I, uh, am kind of trying to be comparatively neutral when we're talking about these systems. Uh, you know, there's affordances and there's limitations on any game system with any population. And of course, the thing about D&D is that there's probably a trusted adult who's has the entire apparatus of Dungeons and Dragons available for students when they're talking about that. And of course, Wizards also provides to educators access to through D&D Beyond a lot of the core books that you'd need to run the game through that policy. And they also have different ways of funding physical books. It's a whole thing, which then became our other discussion of the day, which is the ways in which Quest RPG, because it's very simple printables and very straightforward, even though it too is a commercial product, it doesn't feel as commercial as the handouts from Wizards in interesting kinds of ways. Wizards, of course, has its branding all over the place and its logos and its copyright statements and all of these sorts of things. Um, and it's really intense. And so one of the things that we talked about is access points. TTRPG Kids talks and has available a wide variety of different games at different price points with different levels of sophistication. Physical objects cost money, and it's not necessarily cheaper to produce a PDF, although the TTRPG space often prices things as if it is, kind of erasing the cost of labor, in part because many TTRPGs that are designed for kids are designed by parents and teachers who, scope their ambitions in different kinds of ways. But we did point to some games that are, like Game to Grow games like Critical Core that's designed for neurodivergent players to kind of learn and grow through that system. And there's a whole bunch more that we could only get to in passing. And w- so, one of the things that we ended up talking about pretty extensively near the end was the ways in which Wizards Project is both altruistic in terms of providing materials for free, but of course is part of kind of the same continuum of practice of giving free stuff as influencer marketing, of which I am a Wizards influencer. Uh, I have in front of me the free product disclosure policy, which asks that I verbally disclose in any stream or video that I get when I'm holding up a free thing from Wizards, that I got it for free from Wizards. And indeed, it's required that that be very clear to the audience. And this is true of any kind of TTRPG. Well, really, this is FTC rules, right? If and you don't have to be in a financial relationship where you're being compensated to have to disclose when you get free stuff. And this is a fascinating kind of thing for somebody like me who, as a professor, gets free books all the time. They're called desk copies or review copies. Academic publishers will send me copies of books that they hope I will adopt for my class. It's not a quid pro quo, but it means that I have the ability to get my hands on something and see, if it works, if it looks right, how it's organized, all of those sorts of things. Interestingly, that part of my job is actually phasing out pretty considerably. A lot of desk copies are now just PDFs, or if they're not, and sometimes they're even locked behind particular, like, elaborate apparatuses. This is incidentally, sidebar, but this is something that we talked about in class. This is also something that happens with academic publishing that isn't designed for the classroom. Historically, book reviews have been done by people who have a permanent position, because there were more of them back then. And one of the reasons why you would do a book review is so that you could get your hands on a book that otherwise you might not be able to afford. Some academic books are hundreds of dollars. So, doing a book review for an academic journal of that book and getting a free copy is not inconsiderable payment for that labor. One of the pushbacks that is happening these days is that many academic books are not sending out kind of physical copies, but instead electronic copies of the book. And there's a real debate in the field about whether that is sufficient to get books published. Now, this is far beyond the scope of this office hour kind of impromptu thing. There's lots of pressures. Academic publishing is feeling the squeeze just like every other sector of academia. The professoriate is also deeply underpaid, and very few have tenure like I do. It's a mess all the way around. Academic labor is based on a kind of system of volunteerism that's not really working in a time when not all of us have secure labor. But this is very similar to the state of play for K through 12 teachers who often have to pay for their own materials, or rely on corporate handouts or crowdfunding in much the same way that a lot of people in the TTRPG space do. So gray areas become thick and fast when we're talking about how to get resources that people need to do their jobs in ways that work for them. This is complicated. And so I, uh, there's no one way to read something like Wizards kind of materials for the K through 12 classrooms, or really fourth through eighth grade classrooms. On the one hand, it is pure marketing. The goal is to get students early on to associate D&D with something fun and part of their hobby lives, and so that it becomes the first tabletop role playing game that they have experience with. As we know, many people start with D&D and don't go beyond it. It's pedagogically, to return to this class, one of the reasons why we are in week 13, and this is the first time that we've talked about Dungeons and Dragons in any kind of depth. Now, Dungeons and Dragons has been part of this class kind of in different kinds of ways. It is literally the 8,000-pound dragon in the room. Most actual plays that we've talked about have been of Dungeons and Dragons. Dungeons and Dragons has worked with almost all of the people who we have had as class guests. You can't escape it entirely, but we can work to make sure that D&D is part of a larger ecosystem of practice. And so that's the pedagogical goal of this class, as I talked about with students today. So this is not a tangent. It's important to me to figure out a way to talk about tabletop games and acknowledge the fact that a lot of scholarship and a lot of thinking uses D&D as a default while trying to push back against that kind of default thinking. And I think that today was an interesting success in this way. And I'm suspecting that this exercise of looking at introductory materials designed for children, or at least for a wider span of ages than just kind of late teens and up, is actually potentially a very good way to both introduce um, D&D and get students who are anxious about not knowing anything about D&D. The materials are there to explain. And they do a pretty good job of explaining the contours of D&D. Even if there's a lot of material that's, kind of left out into the player's handbook or the dungeon master's guide. But pairing it with something like Quest RPG to show a different way of thinking. And as we talked about, there's some really fascinating distinctions for Quest RPG. One, money is not part of this. And this is also true of systems that students had adopted. Candela doesn't really think about money in this way. Call of Cthulhu has tiers of income that you calculate in order to not nickel and dime. Many games that students had adopted eschew doing kind of counting of gold pieces full stop, which is really, really helpful. And it's also a question of, the Quest RPG has you create characters with great granularity and specificity without ever talking about species, what used to be called race, um, while also retaining something that Pathfinder will call ancestry. The idea that people who come from communities do have communities that are distinct from one another in meaningful ways, and that should actually be honored. It also gets rid of alignment without, although it has a really interesting relationship to evil that we're still unpacking. It also has an interesting relationship to the knotty problem of divinity in D&D, which we've been seeing in a lot of actual plays, dealing with the notion of gods as agents in the world, which is the nature of just about every canonical D&D setting, kind of gets pushed to the extreme periphery in Quest RPG, so much so that when God or gods were mentioned, it actually struck us all the more because it only happened on 2 of the pages out of the 30 that we close read in the space of class. And also the kind of directive about what you do and how you do it is also really distinct. It's a D20 system, although it is much more forgiving and much closer to some of the kind of hard success or mixed success sort of models of Powered by the Apocalypse or that sort of thing. And so we were able to put these things in a kind of interesting, not complete compare contrast or talk about one as a cleaning of the other. But what was helpful about the fact that we are looking at this pretty late in the game, so to speak, is that I was able to say, hey, in terms of this, in terms of what D&D is doing and what Quest is doing, where does your game fit in, right? Everything from solo journaling games to really punishing games to games like Coyote and Crow that imagine completely different kinds of logics for value in all kinds of ways, which is really, really, really useful. It's uh, and so having a lot of that under our belt, having taken a look at our adopted TTRPGs was really helpful. So this is the trade-off for a future version of this course. On the one hand, putting this early gets everybody up to speed on D&D quick and easily and we're done. And pairing it with another TTRPG means that it doesn't get to dominate even a single day of class. On the other hand, I think our conversation might have not been quite as rich had we not already done at least some looking at adopted TTRPGs. So, this is the thing that I'm going to think about for next year, or, whenever I teach this class next. Of course, that's one of the questions at the moment is this has been a class I've taught every fall, more or less, for the last several years. Whether that will continue is always up in the air. I won't find that out until the spring in a lot of different ways, or possibly even later than the early spring. We'll find out. But this is why we keep these diaries in part. It's, right now, this purpose is for students and folks across the internet, but also I return to them as I think about ways to do stuff next time, which is really, really valuable. So we are now transitioning to our first LARP for Thursday to the award winning, as of this weekend, Golden Cobra most points this year. Um, uh, the archive, which won most points because one of the things that you could win points for in this year's Golden Cobra Challenge was how many other games you referenced. And the archive is an archaeological game where you are LARPing as scholars who have fragments of other LARPs, and you're from the far future trying to figure out what LARPs are. And in a sense, this is what my students are. They don't have necessarily an inborn sense of what LARPs are. So it's going to be very interesting to see how play goes for a naive audience as opposed to the LARP nerd audience that the game originally assumes. So students have been asked to create characters for Thursday before class, which is really a four-step question, very simple. At the very start of class, we will then put those characters in relationship to each other, who are allies, who are rivals to one another, and then it's literally playing around with paper, which allows us to segue into week 14, where students have asked to think about materiality. So we're going to be thinking both digitally and analog when we think about materiality, looking at Demiplane's digital nexus for Avatar: The Last Airbender RPG. Thanks to Demiplane, who have provided that login for free, and a little taste of Banana Chan's just released Forgery. I don't even have the physical object yet, but I do have the PDF, and so we'll play around a little bit with coloring as part of gameplay. And then, because we'll be kind of transitioning into that time when students are highly likely to be leaving town, it's just the nature of the beast. Even though it's a week before Thanksgiving, we have a whole week off. So here we are. So Maggie Baker has very kindly agreed to come for a virtual class visit. So we'll all be online on Zoom to talk about all of the issues that we've been talking about in intensity, the relationship to capitalism and making a living in games, materiality, which more than one student kind of noted that she seems particularly, able to reflect on with us, as well as just reflecting on a career making meaningful and fascinating games. And then it's going to be Thanksgiving, which it's hard to believe. But that's where we are. On Thursday, I'll recap how our quick and dirty LARP, it's a cut down extremely for time version of the game. And so we'll see how it literally plays. But it was a great class discussion today. I was very pleased with how things are going. And now I'm going to go rest my voice for a little while before I've got more meetings tonight, if you can believe it. But until Thursday, have a good one. Bye.